Russian citizens and Ukrainian citizens united against Putin. Russian citizens, whom Russian leader Vladimir Putin has resettled in the regions annexed by Ukraine, have started protesting in the Donetsk region. With the decrease in trust in Vladimir Putin due to the coup attempt in Russia, Russian citizens who were sent to the territory of Ukraine want to return. Putin, who wants to suppress attempts at rebellion, has declared a state of emergency in Donetsk, sending the Russian National Guard to the Donetsk region. The operations of the Ukrainian army in the occupied Donetsk region have exhausted the patience of the people of the region. But the most striking part of the job is that Ukrainian citizens also supported the rebellion started by Russian citizens living in Ukraine. The Russian dominance in the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk regions, which were occupied by the Russian army in the first months of the war, still continues. Although the Ukrainian army continues its operations against the border towns of these four regions, control over the urban centers is still in the hands of the Russian army, as it is known. Vladimir Putin announced that he had annexed these four regions by holding an illegal referendum in these regions. Although Putin's annexation decisions are not accepted by any country, Vladimir Putin claims that these territories now belong to Russia. When Putin's annexation decisions were not accepted by foreign states, Vladimir Putin launched his second plan and began sending tens of thousands of Russian citizens to these annexed regions. Putin's main goal is to organize a legal referendum in these four regions when the war between Russia and Ukraine ends, and to win these referendums, thanks to the Russian citizens he has placed in these regions. This strategy implemented by Vladimir Putin had been progressing successfully so far, but the change in the course of the war and the shaking of Putin's authority due to Yevgeny Prigozhin began to make Russian citizens living in these regions nervous. While the war between Russia and Ukraine is ongoing, the fact that a coup attempt occurred in Russia and the Ukrainian army is now conducting special operations within the borders of Russia has begun to drive citizens living in these regions into fear and panic. Russian citizens settled in the Donetsk region by Putin agreed to live in these regions because of regular salaries and promised lands every month. However, with the Russian economy entering a turbulent period, there have been disruptions in the salaries of Russian citizens living here. Although this situation has made Russian citizens extremely bored, the point that has exhausted the patience of Russian citizens has been the operations of the Ukrainian army in the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian government wanted to take advantage of Prigozhin's coup attempt and moved to retake the Donetsk region, which has been under Russian occupation since the beginning of the war. Aware that the Russian troops fighting on Ukrainian territory are in a weak period, Zelensky launched his first operation in the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian army, stationed in the city of Kramatorsk, a city quite close to the Donetsk region, began to fail to improve air operations with long-range missiles and unmanned combat aircraft to important buildings of the Russian army, such as the command center in the Donetsk region. The Ukrainian army carried out an air operation late at night, launching an attack on a military headquarters in the Donetsk city of Makiivka. The long-range missiles fired by the Ukrainian army from the city of Kramatorsk in Makiivka hit the Russian headquarters in Makiivka, with the missiles hitting. A big explosion occurred at the headquarters, and the darkness of the night left its place to light due to the flames that appeared. According to information obtained from regional sources, it is said that more than 210 Russian soldiers are stationed in Kara. However, it is not known how many Russian soldiers were killed or injured as a result of the operation. The missile hitting the fuel tank located at the headquarters increased the intensity of the explosion even more, and the sound of the explosion could be heard even from miles away. However, this latest operation by the Ukrainian army has enabled Russian citizens living in the region and Ukrainian citizens to unite against Putin. Due to the fact that the Ukrainian army has carried out 3 different air operations in the Donetsk region in the last 2 days, Russian citizens living in this region have led Vladimir Putin to think that he cannot ensure the security of the Donetsk region due to the fact that Wagner's troops captured cities within the borders of Russia in just 1 day. The trust of the Russian people towards Putin had decreased considerably. The loss of control of the Russian army fighting on the territory of Ukraine after the internal disturbances in Russia makes the Russian citizens, whom Vladimir Putin has sent to the annexed regions, very annoying. thousands of Russian citizens living in the Donetsk region took to the streets and began to organize protests for the end of the war. Russian citizens who expressed that they did not want to die for Vladimir Putin began shouting on the streets that they wanted to return to the borders of Russia. The number of rebel Russian citizens whose numbers did not exceed 1,000 in the early morning reached tens of thousands within a few hours. However, the most interesting event was that Ukrainian citizens living in the region also supported these protests initiated by Russian citizens. Tens of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian citizens united and began organizing anti-Putin and anti-war protests on the streets of Donetsk. Russian soldiers stationed in the region could not intervene decently due to the presence of Russian citizens among the demonstrators. However, with the growth of the rebellion and the reflection of this event on the world agenda, Vladimir Putin began to deploy Russian National Guard soldiers known as Rosgvardia to the Donetsk region. Thousands of National Guard soldiers have been sent to the Donetsk region. The National Guard, which is tasked with suppressing the riots here, has been sent on an expulsion mission for the first time with the increasing size of the rebellion. The protesters gathered around the Donetsk governor's building. The Russian governor, appointed by Vladimir Putin, could not leave the building because the building was surrounded by demonstrators. The Russian governor, who stated that a state of emergency had been declared in the region, announced that he had resigned, unable to withstand the pressure of the demonstrators any longer. The regional governor stated that he had declared a state of emergency in the region before terminating his mandate and that they needed the support of the Russian government to suppress the protests. With the growth of events in the region, armed rebels who introduced themselves as the Free Donetsk organization began to appear. The members of the organization, who were quite numerous, consisted of both Russian and Ukrainian citizens. A masked member presumed to be the leader of the organization addressed the protesters gathered in the area and made a statement. In his statement, he stated that they will continue to fight for Ukraine to regain full independence and that they have taken over the administration in the Donetsk region for now. According to information learned later, it turned out that the Free Donetsk organization has been continuing its activities in this region for a long time and has been secretly supported by the Ukrainian government. It was announced by the leader of the organization that the vast majority of sabotage is carried out against Russian forces in the Donetsk region were carried out by members of this organization. Shortly after these events, Russian government officials claimed that the U.S. administration had been secretly supporting this organization for a long time. According to the statements of the spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry at the request of the United States, a number of officials from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry held a secret meeting with members of this organization. During this meeting, it was promised that the Free Donetsk organization would be provided with military equipment and ammunition. There has been no response from the U.S. administration to these claims of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Yet while the protests in the Donetsk region were continuing, the most interesting event happened when the Ukrainian army intervened in these protests. The Ukrainian army, wanting to take advantage of this internal confusion in Donetsk, organized simultaneous operations on two border towns in the Donetsk region, wanting to take advantage of the weakness of Russian forces there. As a result of the ground operation in the towns of Rzivka and Blahodate located on the border with Donetsk, the Russian forces there were completely repulsed. The Ukrainian army regained control by liberating these two towns from the Russian occupation in order to show their support for the ongoing protesters in Donetsk. Thanks to the capture of these two towns by the Ukrainian army, two different supply routes to the Donetsk region have also come under the control of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has divided a battalion of about 4,200 soldiers that had been hibernating in the Donetsk region into two different units. These two troops carried out a simultaneous ground operation on the towns of Morozovka and Blahodate, which were side by side due to the fact that there are not many Russian troops in the towns. The Ukrainian army successfully carried out this ground operation after hours of clashes. The Russian soldiers stationed here began to leave the towns, unable to resist the Ukrainian army's offensive any longer. Interestingly, this operation, carried out by the Ukrainian army, led to the formation of a new movement in the city center where the protests continue. With these operations, the Ukrainian army has shown its support for the protests in Donetsk. thus enabling the Ukrainian and Russian citizens who are rebelling to take action as well. Demonstrators who took to the streets with torches and sticks in their hands continued to give the National Guard soldiers sent by Vladimir Putin a hard time. Even the thousands of National Guards sent by Putin could not suppress these protests taking place in the region. Putin has recalled some of his troops from Ukraine to Russia's borders due to the coup attempt in Russia. The remaining Russian soldiers continue their duties in certain regions of Ukraine. For this reason, the Russian government cannot send more troops to suppress the rebellion here. Putin, who has been tried for war crimes he has committed before, is aware that the international criminal courts will come into play again if he intervenes harshly against citizens here. For this reason, he cannot take a harsh intervention against the protesters. The growth of the rebellion and the resumption of sabotage attempts by members of the Free Donetsk organization in the region again began to annoy the National Guard sent to suppress the rebellion. Members of the organization blew up a Russian ammunition depot in the Donetsk region in a sabotage attempt which led to the formation of a large explosion in the region. Even the protesters were surprised by the impact of the explosion. The National Guardsmen sent to suppress the uprising initially thought that this explosion was an attack by the Ukrainian army. For this reason, some of the National Guardsmen who wanted to save their own lives began to leave the area. However, this explosion was carried out by members of the organization in the region. In fact, the vast majority of Russian soldiers sent to the territory of Ukraine also do not want to die for Vladimir Putin. But out of necessity, they continued to fight on Ukrainian territory. The Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, known as a close friend of Vladimir Putin, stepped in again because these ongoing protests in the Donetsk region could not be suppressed. Kadyrov, who recently sent some of his soldiers to Russia to support Putin during the coup attempt organized by Prigozhin, now wants to send Chechen soldiers to the Donetsk region in the same way. Chechen leader Kadyrov announced that the troops he had sent inside the borders of Russia to prevent the coup would be sent to the Donetsk region. It is expected that the Chechen contingent, estimated to be close to 1,000 in number, will reach the Donetsk region soon. Vladimir Putin is forced to fight the rebellions both within the borders of Russia and within the borders of Ukraine. These events have greatly shaken the authority of Vladimir Putin. After Prigozhin's betrayal, Putin must have been deeply shaken by the betrayal of his own citizens whom Putin had sent to the territory of Ukraine. But Putin made many promises when sending these citizens to the territory of Ukraine, and now he is unable to fulfill any of these promises. For this reason, Russian citizens forced to live in Ukraine are quite right to hold these protests. In addition, these citizens sent by Putin have no means to return. Russian citizens brought to these regions by military vehicles and buses have to request a vehicle again to return. But since Putin has forward-looking plans, he would never want Russian citizens here to turn back. While the protests are continuing in the Donetsk region, the situation is not good within the borders of Russia either. Although Putin has banned protests within the borders of Russia, many organizations still continue to protest in secret. Instead of taking to the streets and shouting, these undercover protesters are taking to the streets late at night, spray painting writings and leaving signs in certain areas of the city. You can see inscriptions such as Putin resign and No to War on the walls of many metro stations and buildings in Moscow. But what Putin should really be afraid of is that Russian soldiers fighting for Putin in Ukraine will mutiny. As it is known, Russia's entry into an economically turbulent period has also affected the Russian soldiers in Ukraine quite badly. We hear on the news that Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine often make the decision to lay down their weapons. The reason why these soldiers decided to lay down their weapons is that the Russian government does not meet the basic needs of these soldiers. Recently, a minority of soldiers in a unit serving in the Luhansk region decided to lay down their weapons, stating that they were not provided with enough provisions and ammunition and had to be fed one meal a day. Although Putin is trying to prevent the spread of these news within the borders of Russia, the world's press is sharing these news. Following the insurrection in the Donetsk area initiated by Russian and Ukrainian residents, Russian troops stationed in the region began to lay down their arms, drawing courage from these rebellions. The fact that such an incident occurred during the Ukrainian conflict astonished the whole globe. The Russian 57th Division, which is fighting Ukrainian soldiers in the Donetsk area. The troopers of the armored division had no choice but to surrender. This move by Russian military, who have long created a reputation for themselves on Ukrainian land, enraged Russian President Vladimir Putin. This occurrence, which occurred within the framework of the Russian-Ukrainian war that has been ongoing for over a year, has startled everyone. 57, which has a lengthy history of accomplishments on Ukrainian land. The armored division men opted to surrender and hand it over to the Ukrainian army. While the Russian army maintains pressure on the Bakhmut front, the Ukrainian army is also engaged in combat with Russian soldiers to seize the Bakhmut front. Russian General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov deployed a large number of soldiers to the region. Russian troops are making their way towards Bakhmut. However, the Russian army has been attempting to seize the city for months without success. The Ukrainian defense lines prevent Russian soldiers from passing through, and the conflict continues. The Ukrainian armed forces are deploying HIMARS missiles behind the Bakhmut front and implementing countermeasures against Russian airstrikes and artillery bombardment. Valery Gerasimov was enraged at the disaster at Bakhmut. In addition, a substantial number of Russian forces stationed in the Donetsk region were sent to Bakhmut. The Russian 57, however, is one of the best troops in the Russian army. Many troops from the armored division deserted and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. There have recently been several tales of Russian soldiers fighting for Vladimir Putin mutinying and surrendering on Ukrainian soil. Because of the growing military concerns, Russian President Vladimir Putin has begun to ponder in the dark because of a lack of food and weaponry. Russian soldiers stationed in Ukraine came to believe that Putin did not regard them. Soldiers stationed at a Russian headquarters in Divka gathered in December to lay down their guns and oppose Putin. The troops, who indicated that they only ate one meal a day and had difficulty finding water, claimed that they were unable to receive care despite suffering from significant health issues. Russian troops who have been suffering from a lack of medications and supplies have set the agenda in the country with film comments. Many Russian headquarters on Ukrainian territory captured by Russian soldiers lack physicians and medications. Russian troops who are injured or ill cannot receive medical treatment as a result. Russian soldiers are either fleeing the conflict or surrendering to the Ukrainian army. However, the number of Russian soldiers surrendering has recently increased. The surrender of 57,300 Russian soldiers from the armored brigade to the Ukrainian army stunned everyone on the instructions of Russian Deputy Defense Minister Valery Gerasimov. Russian soldiers sent from military location in the Donetsk area to help Russian forces in the city of Bakhmut attempted to breach the 5,000-person Ukrainian defensive line. However, the Russian is 57 years old. The men of the armored division diverged from the other Russian troops moving toward the city of Bakhmut. The division's commander, together with a group of 300 people, switched their attention to the city of Izium in the Donetsk area. Decrepitude reigned among the Ukrainian army and the residents of Bakhmut. As a result of this surprise action, after months of Russian occupation, the Ukrainian city of Izium was freed and is currently under the authority of the Ukrainian army. 57 white flags were carried as they proceeded into the city. Troops from the armored division flew these flags from the windows of their trucks. When Ukrainian forces stationed in the city spotted the white flags approaching the Russian armored vehicles that were blocking the city's entrance with tanks, they opted not to open fire by dropping Russian soldiers from trucks. Ukrainian military assaulted a gathering of 300 individuals. Ukrainian forces surrounded the Russian soldiers and led them into town, stripping them of their clothes. The Ukrainian army had captured the Russian soldiers who had surrendered in order to avoid the fight. Everyone was taken aback by the Russian soldiers' words, which were captured on film and shared on social media by Ukrainian officers. Russian soldiers said that they were deployed to Ukraine to serve Vladimir Putin, but Putin ignored them and misled them. Russian troops who left Ukraine's land reported that they were imprisoned in Ukraine because they knew they would be sentenced to prison. Vladimir Putin has previously declared that soldiers who left the conflict would be punished to jail. Following this statement, the troops were found guilty in Ukraine. As a result, rather than retreating, Russian soldiers chose to surrender to the Ukrainian army. Russian President Vladimir Putin is attempting to conceal from his people the problems that the Russian military is encountering on Ukrainian soil. Since the Russian army's invasion of Ukraine, it has been evident that it does not respect the rights of Ukrainian civilians. The invading Russian military are either forcefully taking civilians from the cities they have taken in Ukraine or dragging them to Russia. Even in Mariupol, the first city taken on Ukrainian soil, Ukrainian civilians are being harassed and pushed to flee as a result. According to Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, Anton Gerashenko, about 30,000 Ukrainian civilians from Mariupol have been transferred to Russia by Russian military so far. Russia is demolishing Ukrainian villages, rendering them untenable and forcing Ukrainian inhabitants to flee. The purpose of Russia is considered to be to relocate Russian nationals in these areas while cleansing Ukraine of its own inhabitants. Western countries are outraged because the Russian military is causing damage to towns, buildings, hospitals, and social infrastructure. European governments have also stated that Putin's actions constitute war crimes and that he should be prosecuted after the war. According to Ukraine's advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs, Gerashenko, Putin perpetrated human rights breaches on Ukrainian soil and called himself the Hitler of the century. The Russian army's tough attitude in every seized zone on Ukrainian land continues, prompting Ukrainian residents to escape to Western nations. Russian forces are transporting almost all Ukrainians who are unable to evacuate to Western nations to Russia. It is estimated that over 1 million Ukrainian nationals have migrated to Western nations so far. The Polish government, which embraced Ukrainians without hesitation and gave the required aid, was the country that provided the most assistance to Ukrainian people. Putin forbids journalists from publishing information regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict since the day it took Ukraine's land. The Russian government has failed to provide its population with proper information. Instead, he continues to air misinformation on Russian television. The takeover of Ukrainian land has enraged dozens of countries which have opted to censure Russia and apply sanctions. The Russian economy has suffered as a result of the sanctions, which has enraged even Putin's allies. In addition, Putin continues to promote his propaganda through television and social media in order to soothe the Russian people. The amount of primarily false news headlines concerning Russia's military victories in Ukraine has recently surged. It is worth noting that the Russian government frequently produces similar misinformation. However, some journalists chose to travel to Ukraine and report on the newest developments in order to reveal the true face of the war. Journalists who sought photographs from the front were escorted by the Ukrainian army to the headquarters of Ukrainian forces and interviewed Ukrainian soldiers to refresh their knowledge. These brave journalists did everything they could to get first-hand information on the state of the battle during the conflict in Ukraine. Journalists wearing protection suits with the word press were attacked by Russian military. Journalists were present to see the war's destruction following the incident. Ukrainian military rushed the journalists to a safe location. The Ukrainian Interior Minister's advisor, Anton Gerashenko, had previously warned of Russian military strikes on the press. Gerashenko stated that many Ukrainian journalists are still being kept hostage in Russian-occupied areas and have not been freed. This circumstance leads Putin to believe, including the people of the world, who are aware of Russian military activities on Ukrainian soil, that they are succeeding in Ukraine and are attempting to conceal their actions. The Russian government has been obliged to take dramatic steps in response to Ukraine having the upper hand in the battle. While Russian President Vladimir Putin tries to conceal from the international press and his own countrymen that he is losing the battle on Ukrainian land, the operation of the Azov Battalion against Russian soldiers, which we frequently read about, has generated a large agenda. The Azov Battalion, known as Ukraine's Special Forces, ambushed the Russian regiment as it continued its offensive on the Bakhmut front. More than 335 Russian troops were killed in this action, and a Russian regiment of 2,000 people was defeated. The battle between Russia and Ukraine, which has lasted more than 15 months, is being keenly watched by the whole globe. While everyone is looking forward to the conclusion of this conflict, intriguing news about it is still coming from Ukraine. The Azov Battalion, comprised of Ukrainian Army Special Forces men whose name we have frequently heard throughout the conflict, has inflicted a huge blow to the occupying Russian forces on the Bakhmut front. The Russian Union was pressured on the Bakhmut front and suffered a devastating defeat as a result of the strategic plan planned by the Ukrainian Union commanders. In terms of the news specifics, the Russian army currently controls a portion of the Donetsk area that was taken in the early months of the fighting. Vladimir Putin, who has wanted to take Bakhmut for months, is adamant about not withdrawing his troops despite losing hundreds of Russian men every day on this front. As is well known, the Russian army occupied the city of Lyman in the Donetsk region in the early months of the war. However, during the middle of the conflict, the occupying Russian forces were forced to leave from this region as a consequence of a ground operation conducted by Azov Battalion men in the city of Lyman on the instructions of Volodymyr Zelensky. The Azov Battalion, which had been stationed in Lyman for a long time, was reactivated after the Ukrainian army on the Bakhmut front, which had successfully repelled Russian army attacks for months, learnt that the Russian army would launch a fresh offensive. A comprehensive strategic plan was devised. Wagner troops in the city of Soledar began to be deployed to the Bakhmut front on the orders of Russian General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov. Putin, who planned a large-scale offensive here with Russian forces and Wagner men, was dead set on capturing Bakhmut. The Ukrainian intelligence service alerted the Ukrainian unit commanders on the Bakhmut front after discovering that Wagner forces had left the headquarters in the city of Soledar and arrived in the city of Bakhmut. Despite the fact that the Ukrainian army had established a massive defensive line on the Bakhmut front, such an offensive was extremely difficult to repel. Following it, Ukrainian President Zelensky decided to move Azov forces stationed in Lyman to the Bakhmut front. However, this was no ordinary military shipment. The Azov battalion's purpose here was to blockade the Russian army by emerging at a moment when the Russian troops were believed to be on the attack. As a result, the Azov battalion departed Lyman and headed for the Bakhmut front. After hours of marching, the Azov unit arrived at the Bakhmut front. The Azov warriors came behind the Russian army as the Russian forces continued their offensive here. Russian soldiers had to return to their positions after realizing they were being blockaded. While the Azov forces continued their attack, Ukrainian troops on the Bollywood front began to apply pressure. Surprisingly, the Russian forces attempted to reply to the Ukrainian army strikes since they couldn't escape out of the location they were in. After hours of struggle, however, Azov forces began to push on the Russian army. When the Russian troop commander realized his forces were about to be trapped, he ordered them to flee. A substantial number of Russian soldiers were killed while attempting to flee, while others were eliminated during the fight. The Azov battalion, which has participated in several successful actions since the beginning of the conflict, was able to rebuff the Russian army's offensive in Bakhmut. The Russian forces swiftly left the region. The Russian army is said to have returned to its Russian headquarters in the city of Soledar. The Azov battalion's success got a standing ovation in the Ukrainian parliament, according to Ukrainian sources. Russia attempted to invade the city of Bakhmut with a force of more than 2,400 soldiers, but the Ukrainian army resisted the onslaught. According to the most recent figures, the Russian army has sustained 335 losses in this combat. According to Ukrainian official statements, the Russian army is losing more than 600 soldiers on the Bakhmut front every day. However, the Russian government does not recognize Ukraine's published figures since the commencement of the conflict. The Ukrainian government has been updating the entire world about the progress of the war by publishing updated statistics on combat deaths every month. However, the Russian government is nearly like a closed box when it comes to this subject. Russian President Vladimir Putin has refused to justify the losses sustained on Ukrainian land when certain members of the press questioned Vladimir Putin about not informing his people. He responded that this information is a state secret and would not be revealed. Many professional analysts, however, believe that Putin's unwillingness to divulge this information is due to a different cause. With the outbreak of the war, Russia saw a significant division. On one hand, there are pro-Putin Russian citizens who favor the war, and on the other there are anti-war Russian citizens. Since the commencement of the conflict, anti-war Russian people have staged rallies in several Russian cities and sought to bring the war to an end. However, Vladimir Putin was able to put a stop to these protests at every turn. 15th year of the conflict. According to estimates released by the Ukrainian government earlier this month, the Russian army has lost almost 200,000 servicemen on Ukrainian soil. If Putin confirms this, a great revolt in Russia might begin, and Putin is well aware of this. As a result, Putin is hesitant to make pronouncements himself while repeatedly contradicting Ukraine's facts. Many Russian experts have repeatedly said that this conflict would have a devastating impact on the Russian economy and people. Russia has not yet experienced economic hardships in the early months of the conflict. As a result, the Russian people always assumed that this would be the case, but they were mistaken. The economic sanctions placed on Russia by the United States and Western countries, as well as the difficulty in funding the Russian army, caught Russia off surprise. In addition to Russia's volatile economy, the Russian people's reaction was not delayed when inflation rates began to rise. Even pro-Putin Russian nationalists who backed Putin in the early months of the conflict say the war should stop. However, it is generally known that Putin is unconcerned by the opinions of his own population. Putin is attempting a variety of techniques to oppress the Russian people. To begin with, Putin, who wants to prevent rallies in Russia, grants Russian security forces complete ability to suppress protests staged in Russia. Putin, however, did not simply obstruct the Russian people. Putin, who also curbs press freedom, has outlawed any news in Russia that is anti-war or disparages the Russian military. As previously reported, Putin jailed and sentenced to house detention several of the members who had previously protested the war on live television. No major network can now broadcast anti-war news. Not only that, but there's more. Putin is attempting to prevent Russian citizens from accessing information by limiting access to Russian news websites. New changes have recently occurred at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Although the Russian people are utterly uninformed of the situation with the revelation of a leak at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which is under Russian army station, there is speculation that the Russian soldiers here should be evacuated. Putin is unconcerned if international nuclear energy officials suggest that Russian troops should leave the nuclear power plant and that the plant should be examined by authorized personnel. Putin's main hope is that this nuclear power station continued to operate and that the energy produced here belongs exclusively to Russia. As a result, Putin is transferring Ukrainian engineers and laborers here to be replaced by his own engineers and personnel. According to reports, a Ukrainian engineer who formerly worked at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station was reporting to Ukrainian authorities every movement of the Russian troops here. Vladimir Putin appears to be operating more cautiously now that this has out.